The Bible makes it abundantly clear. There's a time to be born and a time to die. There's a time to rejoice.
What is it about this scene that sends a cold shiver up and down our spines? Is it the person inside the casket? That person we once loved so dearly, and now is nothing but a fading memory in our minds? Or is it the person who stands on the other side of that? The one who in that moment is faced with the reality that no matter how much exercise or sleep they get, no matter how many carbs they cut, no matter how much money they give to the poor, or how much time they spend mentoring the little children, that no matter what they achieve, no matter how many awards they receive in their life, in the end, they will be the ones laying in this place, and they will be the ones who slowly become a fading memory in the minds of those who love them. Ashes to ashes, and dust to dust. Today, I don't ask that you sit through just another chapel sermon, but I ask that you would join me on the journey. So many of us lately have lost those that we love, and so many others have had to comfort those who have sat through as someone stands on the other side of death looking in. Today, I want to tell you a story about a man I met back in junior high. His name was John. When I met John, he was trying desperately to find what his hope and peace was in life. He had tried going through drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. He went through bouts of depression and even threatened suicide at times. In the end, he found nothing that truly filled his life. When I was in youth group on an IYC trip, our youth pastor challenged us to pray for one single person. And whenever we heard a certain noise, that would be our cue to remember to pray for them that day. I could have chosen a barking dog. That had been significant because John was a physically intimidating man. Even in junior high, he was pushing 6 feet. And as he grew, he would go well over 300 pounds. And so John would go into places with us like the mall, and he would come up behind anyone from little ladies to 30-year-old men. And he would just sneak up behind them, and he would just go, and just bark at them. And then when the guys would turn around like, okay, you're big, you can get away with that. He would do little things like this all the time. He had his own little noises. And so on that time I could have picked a dog's bark, but instead, for some reason I picked a car horn. And every time a car horn went off, I prayed for John that he would turn his life over to Christ and find what he was seeking. A couple years later, my friend David and I were standing in the youth group, and as we were leading some of the junior high kids through a game, we turned and all of a sudden John was sitting on the stage watching what was going on. I was wrapped up and helping, so my friend David went over there, and he was kind of confused. He was like, John, what are you doing here? Because John had told us previous to this that he would never step foot in a church because he was afraid that he might burst into flames. And he was not joking. He believed that. So seeing him in there, our minds were reeling as to why we could possibly be in this place. And so John explained to us that earlier on in the week, he had been reading the book of Revelation, and God had really started speaking into his life. And in that moment, he decided that it was time to turn his life over to Jesus Christ. And I've heard preachers before say things like, and in the very moment that he was saved, he gave up all of his addictions and all of his bad habits. And I I'd never actually seen that before, so I never believed those people when they said those things. But for John, at least in part, it was very true. In the moment he asked Christ into his life, he gave up pot, he gave up drinking, and he gave up smoking, as if there had never been another habit in his life. He also went through and did something that's pretty common to the Christian culture. He went and got rid of all of his secular music, only to spend the next few years trying to buy all of it back. But John, as on fire as he was, didn't stay that way. We had an event called Live Weekend, where Mike Weeks and Travis Blankenship came down, and we had this big event in our church. And in that day, John got up in front of everyone, and he proclaimed to them just how on fire for God he was, and how much of a difference God had made in his life. But not 2-3 months later, Joe, our youth pastor, asked John to maybe clear up a few things in his life before he would come on to the student leadership team. And at first, John accepted this and took it with such a humble and gracious heart to say, you know what, there are things in my life that I need to fix. There are things I need to get rid of. But then, as if his mind had just completely done a 180, he turned, and all of a sudden, everything that was in his life that was wrong was Joe's fault, and everything was the fault of the church. And he even went so far away from God as to try and pull those younger kids in our group away and get them out of the church. This is where all of you come into the story. This was around my first year here at MACU. And I'd come here and taken Good Life and Witness and gone through and found out that God was this great person that I thought I had known before I got here, but I had no clue who he really was. He was a God of love, but also a God of holiness. A God who was consistent with the word Father, and a God who you can see represented in the life of Jesus Christ. That summer, I had the opportunity to intern back at my home church, and I still had all these ideas fresh on my heart. And so, John and I sat and we shared this. A couple years later, I'm interning again, this time in Lexington, Kentucky with Julie Abbott. And we're preparing for another IYC. During the planning preparation, I get this call. It's from David. And he says, hey man, I just wanted to let you know. Last night, John had some bad stomach pains and he got put into the hospital. But he doesn't want you to know because he doesn't want you calling up and preaching at him. So I said, okay. I waited. A couple days later, John called me. When I answered the phone, I didn't know who I was talking to. Because this man who had once been so physically intimidating that he could walk up behind 35-year-old men in the mall and bark at them and have them cower, now sounded like a 12-year-old girl. His voice was frail and weak. And in that moment, he told me what had gone on. You see, when they took him into the hospital to check for what was wrong with his stomach, they found that he had several pounds of cancer growing in his stomach. This cancer was so advanced and so rare that the doctors who were treating him Googled it and found only 5 websites that even mention it. This cancer was so aggressive that from the time they found it to the time John had called me, over half of his stomach had been taken up by this mass. And in that moment, John said something that I'll never forget. He said, Lee, I want you to call Joe, and I want you to ask him to do my funeral. We were waiting until 10 o'clock that night to leave for IYC. This was early in the morning. I went home and spent the rest of the day between talking to people, crying, and sleeping. I didn't know what to do. I found comfort in a verse in the Bible. One of the great kings is speaking, and he says, the day of man's death is far greater than the day of man's birth, because that is the end of every man, and the living take it to heart. seeing what was going on in John's life, it caused something deep down inside of me. It caused me to start to reflect and look at my own life critically and figure out what was going on inside of my heart. Later on, I found a verse that spoke to what the situation I was going through. It's Deuteronomy 30, 19 through 20. If you have your Bibles, you can open up to it. God is speaking here to the Israelites who have turned from Him so many times. And He is speaking to them with kindness and compassion in His heart, but with a firmness in His voice. And He says, I call heaven and earth as witness against you today, to show that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you might live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying His voice, and by holding fast to Him. This is your life. You see, in looking on myself, I realized that when you're standing on the other side of death, certain things start to happen to you. First of all, you start to reflect about what's going on inside your own heart and what you're doing with your own life. That verse talks about that God has set before us a choice. And never in all of your life is it more present in your mind that you have a choice to live or to die. See, Jesus talked about this a lot. When He was wandering through Israel with His disciples, He would constantly tell them, I am going to die soon, and then I will rise 3 days later. And they didn't understand what He was talking about, but He viewed His life in light of His death. And He asked them to do the same thing. He told them several times, take up your cross, die to yourself daily, and in this you will find real life. As I began to deal with John's life and the end of life, I started to think about what my own heart and what my own motives were for life. Was I living to pour myself out into other people? Or was I just trying to increase my own popularity, wealth, my own sense of security, my future? And as I critically looked at that, I started to realize that God had set before me two paths. One of these paths was filled with myself, with arrogance, with pride, with lust, with abominations that make the Lord's heart break. But see, that's the path that looks better. That's the path that's filled with entertainment, with self-love, with arrogance, with pride, with acclamation. There's this other path over here, and it doesn't look very nice. Not very many people are going down this path, and it's hard. This path is led by daily choices to die to yourself. This path is filled with giving up those things that you want to keep, with losing those things that you think you need so much in your life. This path looks like it leads to death. And to be honest, it does. To be honest, this path leads to here. But it's only in going to that path and in dying to yourself that you can allow Jesus to work in your life. I have set before you life and death. And as I started to reflect on this, I started to see something else going on in John's life. John was stuck in the hospital. Not only that, he was stuck in bed. They had done some radical surgery on him to try and get rid of the cancer, which meant that they had split him from one end to the other. On top of that, they had done some of the most intensive chemotherapy that they ever could have. And because of this, the chemo weakened his body so much that he was unable to heal. So he laid in bed with a gaping scar, worried and afraid because the cancer that they had cut out had already, within a couple weeks' time, grown back. And the doctors were worried that if he even were to sit up, that the cancer might put too much weight on this wound and cause it to burst. So John is stuck in his bed. But I noticed in all of this that he was surrounded by those who loved him. His mother left her job and stayed with him 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. She took one day off to heal her own mind and go play golf and relax. The rest of her time was spent there. And his friends, who loved him dearly, would go up to the hospital and spend anywhere from 12 to 24 hours there, staying with him, being around him, reading, talking to him when he would talk. And in that moment I realized that on the other side of death, that you're not the only one that's affected. You begin to think about yourself, but you begin to think about the community and the family that surrounds you. When I got that call, I had just come from seeing the movie Click. And if you've seen Click, you know that there's a part in it where Adam Sandler starts realizing that he's wasted his life, and that he's ignored his family, and that he's done all these great things and achieved all these great goals, but missed what's truly important in life. And in that night, right before David called, I called up my mother and I just apologized for only ever calling her when I needed something. And then this hit. And I started to think about all the people who just mean so much to me in my life. And I realized that the choices that I make not only affect me, but they affect them as well. I've set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you might live. But God didn't stop there. He said you and your descendants. Today, this would be like saying you and those who are closest to you, those who will take on your heritage, those who you love. You see, death has a community effect, but the way you live your life has a community effect as well. Every choice you make, whether it goes down the path that looks like it leads to life, or the path that leads to denying yourself unto death, every step you take down that path, you make it easier for someone else to take those steps as well. If you live a life of denying yourself and living in only death, dying to those things that would cause true spiritual death in your life. Or if you go down here and you try and indulge in yourself, and you try and live your life only for you, or for what you can achieve, or for what you can do, those who are closest to you will watch the steps you take. And the footprints that you leave will be the places that they put their shoes to walk. Death causes us to think about ourselves. It causes us to come together. And it causes us to think about our relationship with God. This verse goes on, and it says, so choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants. But it does not stop there. It gives you the next step. It says choose life by loving the Lord your God, by obeying His voice, and by holding fast to Him. See, at this time in John's life, I had purposely not directly confronted him about his walk with God. But I had sat and had many conversations with him. And in those conversations, John told me that his walk with God had never, in his words, had never left. He had just taken a detour for a while. And he had never walked completely away from Jesus Christ. He had just walked away from living the way Christ would ask him to live. And so we sat with John and we talked with him. Our pastor, who was going to preside over his funeral, came to him. And in that day, one of the last moments that I have of John's life was Sarah Murphy, the Lovett parents, Harold Bradshaw, and myself sitting with John and taking communion with him for the last time, as his family, who were not believers, watched everything happen. And in those moments, I started to think more about my relationship with God than ever. You see, I was worried about John's relationship with God. But God started poking and prodding me through this to say, are you loving me? Are you obeying my voice? Are you holding fast to me? And as I started to reflect on that, I realized in some ways I was. And in other ways, I was consumed with pride, with anger, with lust, with the sense of self that blocks out all others. I was consumed with myself while I was saying I love God. Today, God lays before all of us a choice. We all are now sitting in the shadow of one of the most talked about deaths of all time. This past Sunday, this past week in fact, we celebrated the death of Jesus Christ and the resurrection that brought him back to life. See, God sets before you two choices. He sets before you life and death, blessings and a curse. But we know that in him, he has already stepped out of that grave. And he's the only one that will be there for us when we choose to come alive. Today, on your cards, you should have all received a little packet. On the back side, it asks you to write down some things that are in your life that are holding you back from God. Think about what is it that holds you back from God? Is it yourself? Is it pride, lust, anger? Is it a sense that you must be the most popular person? Or that you're just trying to get by? Is it a sense that you want to build and accumulate as much as you can? Or is it just a sense that you think you're more important than God and can do it on your own? Whatever it is today, I ask you to write that down on that paper. Now, no one will see this, but as the worship team leads us into a time of celebration, I ask that you would consider tearing that off and placing it in the casket here, signifying to God that you have chosen to die to yourself and to put to rest that thing that has held on to you for so long. And then as we worship, it gets so common practice here at MACU for us to say that we're a community, and then when we're in these environments, we sit in our little cubicle, doing all we can not to bump the other person, not to touch in any way. Well, I ask you to break through that today. As you place that up in the casket, or whether you place it in the casket or not, ask that rather than sitting or standing in your own little space there, that you would come up and just be a part of the community up front. Just come up here together and just sing and worship God. Begin to choose life. Choose to die to yourself so that you might live. And lastly, today at 12 o'clock, between 12 and 1, I ask those of you who would to be willing to be out in the halls and before class, after class, if there's people wandering through. And I ask that for once, we would be willing to reach out to others. Not just to stand back and say, hey, we're here for you if you need any prayer. But to physically go up to someone and say, hey, what's going on in your life right now? What can I pray with you about? What are you struggling with in this moment? And pray with them. Pray with 2, 3 people. And see if that doesn't make a difference in your life. The living takes it to heart. All of us have sat in the shadow of death at some point. If not a loved one, then this Easter season. I ask you today to realize that God has set before you life and death. But it's your choice to live or to die. And it's in every choice that you make that walks you down the path that leads to destruction, or the path, the harder path, that leads you to life. I pray that you would realize that, and that you would open your life up to God's timing today. As we go into a time of worship, I just ask that you would stand and be willing to come up and place those sins, those hindrances in the casket. And if you would, join together, whether in your aisle or up here at the front, and just worship God in community. Worship God together. I believe